Josh Holland is joining us now, as I promised you at the top of the show. So over the weekend, pro-Trump sore losers descended on Washington, D.C. to wreak some havoc, and chief among them were members of the hate group, the Proud Boys. The group self-identifies as Western chauvinists, and they spent the weekend, burning Black Lives Matter flags and whatnot. They've been emboldened during the Trump years, putting it mildly. But what will their fate be once Biden takes office? Josh Holland is here to discuss. Josh, welcome. Josh is the host of the podcast We've Got Issues. It's great to see you here, Josh. I love having you on the program. How's it going?
It's going okay, Juliana. How's it going with you?
Good. Did you attend the, is it a boogaloo? If it's not the Boogaloo Boys, is it what do they call it these days when they have a little party of white supremacists on the nation's capital?
Well, if they were a little darker, we call it a riot, but they're white people. So we call it tensions flaring. Tensions flaring.
Yes, tensions flaring.
In the Capitol.
Yes, tensions flaring. That's hilarious. I love it. Yes, they're usually very calm when they're discussing fascism.
Yes. This right-wing thuggery has been going on for a while now, and it's not new. It preceded Trump, but obviously he has emboldened and encouraged them, and these groups have seen their ranks grow in numbers over the Trump years, and they've become more brazen. And, the president of the United States has told them to stand back and stand by and be prepared, and they are being fired up by these constant, relentless efforts to delegitimize the election. And they're being told by ostensibly credible sources, that is to say, the president of the United States, the number one ranked cable TV news network, other networks like OANN and Newsmax that are growing in prominence. They're being told constantly that they're on the winning side, that President Trump not only won among so-called legal votes, but won in a decisive landslide, and is being deprived by widespread fraud. So this is all predictable. I mean,
can you talk specifically about the Proud Boys? Before Trump, many hadn't even heard of the group. What do we need to know about them specifically? There are so many of these groups. I understand they have different philosophies. What is it about the Proud Boys that we need to know?
I mean, so the Proud Boys is the most prominent of these kind of groups that are explicitly about fighting. As you say, they're not the only one. There's the Patriot Prayer group. There's various 3%ers and others that carry weapons and go to protest to intimidate people. But these guys are explicitly a fight club. They were organized to go and tangle on the streets, which is not uncommon for fascist movements to have groups of young, pissed off, often intoxicated men going out and punching people.
Unbelievable.
It's not unique to us, obviously. And the thing that I would note is that, there's a lot of both sidism, because there is a counter group on the left that likes to go and tussle with these people. But one thing that I would point out is that
who would want to do that? That does not sound like a great idea. Look how terrifying these people are. We've got a photo.
So all decent people are anti-fascism, but Antifa is a specific group, loose network of activists who believe specifically that these people need to be confronted at all points now, when they are still in a kind of fringe movement, in order to keep them from gaining mainstream traction and becoming and being a vanguard for a real institutional fascist movement. So a lot of them believe that they need to confront these folks on the streets wherever they show up. And what I was getting at in terms of avoiding the both sidism is, I think it's important to understand that these conflicts, these street fights, are almost exclusively, it may be exclusively, in very liberal enclaves, right? So
Portland.
they get on buses and they travel to places where there are leftists because they want to fight. So you see this in Portland, Oregon. You see it in Seattle. You've seen it in Berkeley, California.
You know, I used to
Now
live
in
in
DC,
Park
which
Slope
is-
in Brooklyn, and they actually came for a march there. It was maybe four years ago, and we were like, "What?" Everyone was just drinking lattes. You know, I don't know what they were expecting.
I mean, they have come to New York. They have. I mean, you know, this is the thing that that is not a both sides thing. You are not seeing groups of leftists get on buses and travel to Mobile, Alabama to fight with right wingers, right? This is a one directional thing.
Not to take the side, obviously, but wouldn't the argument be from right-wing news sources that when there's a Black Lives Matter protest, allies come in from other places to support? Isn't that what they would say? Let's differentiate it for people.
Well, I mean, if you want to differentiate, there's a lot to unpack in terms of differentiating it. It's clearly the case that people come from other places to participate in protests. The difference is that these guys train to fight and specifically go to places where they can find leftists to fight with. And that is not something that you see on the other side. You know, I also think that there's a huge difference in terms of how these groups are policed relative to Black Lives Matter protests. I've covered a lot of protests over the years, and I've seen the way that policing ultimately can lead to various outcomes, right? So hyper aggressive policing, which is perceived by crowds to be often arbitrary, will push an otherwise peaceful crowd into scattered acts of vandalism or violence. Basically, it causes people to blow off steam in various ways. These guys are often supported by the police, protected by the police. You never see these guys, or very, very rarely do you see these guys face, tear gas and batons and stuff, because a lot of most police officers are sympathetic with their cause.
We saw that this past week there were nearly 36 people arrested during, what they called a night of unrest in downtown Washington. Yeah. So how did these people? Why were these folks arrested?
Well, I wasn't on the ground in DC, and the police are not being forthcoming about. So far, the police have not been forthcoming about the ideological identities of the perpetrators or the victims.
Oh, wow!
They're
saying 36 people were arrested, but it could have been 36 Black Lives Matter counter protesters that were arrested.
Well, 36 people were arrested. We know that 4 people were stabbed in Washington D.C. One critically.
Jesus.
We know that a counter protester was shot on the West Coast. So there have been acts of violence.
Wow.
Yes, police are not forthcoming about the identities of who were arrested and how that number broke down. I would be very surprised if they were all protesters or all counter protesters, just having covered a lot of these things. But
even just getting the images that we're showing here, this is the counter protesters. There's 3 people. And this is the protesters.
I mean, it's hard to say, what all of these incidents, to characterize all of these incidents, especially because most of the day, according to reports, police were able to keep these groups separate. They were mostly peaceful during the day, and then after people had a time to, get some liquid fuel, some liquid courage in, and broke away from the main protest. That's where these incidents happened. There were a number of skirmishes after dark on side streets, where cops were not able to intervene.
Josh, how does this benefit President Trump as he winds down his days in office? What benefit is this to him? And do you believe that that in some way his administration is not just passively inciting these things, but actively calling these people to do this kind of mayhem?
Well, I mean, the way that it advantages them in the short term, and I would extend this to a larger group of kind of extremists, is it puts an intense amount of pressure on Republican lawmakers to, we've seen Republican secretaries of state, Republican election officials getting death threats and serious death threats across the country. This is part of a larger campaign. Let's not isolate the Proud Boys, but the flirtation with violent extremism, the talk of civil war and insurrection acts, and there have been calls to impose martial law and bring the military in to administer a new election, crazy stuff. All of that serves to keep control over the Republican Party in a way that he wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, this is a lame duck president. He'll be out in 30 some odd days. I don't know exactly how many days from now. And, normally what you would see is the party, basically someone like this screaming about fraud and it's been stolen. He would be, like a guy on a bus, some crazy guy needs help, some sort of intervention. But what
I just saw a skit with the
what we're seeing right now is, mostly Republican elected officials are on board. At least they're trying to have their cake and eat it too by not, at a minimum, they're not, refudiating this nonsense. And part of that is that they're afraid of the reaction of his extreme base, his cultist base. Yeah.
Josh, that leads us right into the next question. Now that Trump is soon to be out of office, what does it mean for the future of the Proud Boys and other groups like this? Is there something Biden can do other than just adjusting the rhetoric so everybody calms down? I mean, what's the future look like for these folks?
Well, I mean, I think that I would first of all say that, and this is, I always say this whenever we talk, I'm always very clear about how hard it is to predict how things will shake out, because we are in fairly uncharted territory. We have been for years. Having said that, I think that we can look at the recent past for some indications. I think that, they've set up a situation where we're going to have a more extreme, potentially more violent Tea Party situation. And these guys are going to be a part of that, a big part of that. So, I'm not sure if I mentioned this last time, but we may have talked about this, but you can't accuse Joe Biden of having been born in Kenya, right? I mean, that's just not going to fly. The guy's from Scranton. He's been in, he's a white guy. He's been in DC for 78 years. I mean, it's just not going to fly. So this is a birtherism 2.0. It's a different way of delegitimizing his presidency. You can't say he's ineligible to be president because he wasn't born here, but you can say he lost by millions and is only president because of widespread fraud. And the effect is the same in that, they're stirring up a hornet's nest of people who will oppose this presidency instinctively, reflexively, without giving it any kind of, without regard to anything that they do.
And it's not just them. When I have come across people who, I asked, I think I might have told this story before on the air, but there was a guy breaking a tree down, a sapling, to retrieve a small plastic ball in a lake that was probably like a 99-cent ball. And I was like, dude, don't break the tree. There's sticks on the ground. And he went ballistic. I was literally pregnant. And he was like, you're a baby killer. And I'm like, well, okay, not this time. I what was I going to say to that?
No, we have a lot of angry people, but
the thing that they're drumming up is hatred for liberals, not just hatred for Biden, but it's really literal, turning liberals and even centrist Democrats into
even Republicans,
devils.
Republicans now.
So that's good. That makes me feel slightly better.
And the other the other historic reality that I would, that I think we may see repeated is the militia movement of the 90s. This was in response to Bill Clinton. There was something similar in that, we look back on Bill Clinton as this kind of, centrist, triangulating, third way guy, rightly so. At the time, though, it was a huge cultural shift to have an opponent of the Vietnam War come to power, right? That was a huge thing. That was the first hippie, former ex-hippie president. And for the right, that was an eye-opening assault on their sensibility, right? We had Democrats who had been World War II veterans previously, and that was one thing. And here was the guy who had protested against Vietnam, and here he was president. And the militia movement gained a lot of power and influence, and it ended up in the Oklahoma City bombing. And it was after the Oklahoma City bombing that they went back into the shadows. They lost a lot of followers. The militia movement really cracked up after that. There were dozens of children killed in that bombing, among others. White children. And, we have seen, fortunately, and I'm going to literally knock on wood here. I mean, we've seen law enforcement thwart a number of very scary planned attacks, kidnapping governors and murdering them on TV. And
what is this, the Taliban?
There was a plot to shoot up a Black Lives Matter protest with multiple automatic weapons, and I fear that one of these will go through, and that will be the kind of eye opener that causes people within the mainstream right to understand that they need to back off.
Look at the Frankenstein that they created.
Exactly. They have even if they don't have a direct responsibility for inciting violence, the insurrection theory of the Second Amendment alone, the idea that we need to have guns to keep a tyrannical government at bay, that alone is, central to these people's
wouldn't it be helpful to just have votes to keep the tyrannical government at bay? I mean, we're not there yet.
Separation of powers. That was what the framers would have been appalled at, the idea that, the rabble had guns to keep government at bay. They thought that having checks and balances was the way to go.
Josh, is there anything legislatively that could be done or that might be done to, we already have, you're not allowed to kill people, but that doesn't seem to be putting the kibosh on any of this. Is there anything legislatively that a Biden administration could do?
So legislatively, I don't know. And we don't know how the two Senate runoffs are going to shake out in Georgia, right? So it seems unlikely that you will get some sort of sweeping legislation to address this domestic terrorism statute. And also, those things are always very, very fraught because they can be used against. It's very easy to slip from saying, okay, it's illegal to organize, violent groups, to it's illegal to organize based on ideology or belief systems. But I would point out that there's a lot of laws on the books that we just aren't enforcing. And all 50 states, according to a report by the Brennan Center of Justice, have some sort of militia laws that could be enforced and generally are not being enforced, that bar people from parading with weapons and doing things like that without some sort of regulation or dispensation from the government. Basically, there was the Second Amendment does say a well-regulated militia has, is connected to the right to bear arms. And all 50 states have some sorts of laws, at least curtailing the degree to which people can use weapons to achieve, to achieve political ends, to protest. And those could be enforced, and those should be enforced.
Well said. I guess that's a good place to leave it. We'll see what happens as this movement continues. Josh, what is coming up this week on We've Got Issues?
We've got issues this week. We're going to speak to David Dayan. He's the executive editor of the American Prospect. And we're going to talk about some of the things that the Biden administration can do without Congress, just with executive powers. And it's actually related to what we were just talking about. There's a lot of laws on the books that are valid statutes that can be interpreted in a more progressive way than they have been in the past, and can be used to further a progressive agenda even without a functional Congress.
Excellent. Don't miss that. It's called We've Got Issues. Comes out on Thursdays, right, Josh?
Comes out Thursday at midnight. So
Thursday at midnight. Stay up.
Kind of Friday morning. Yeah.
Josh Hall. That's how you follow Josh on the Twitters.
Joshua Hall.
Joshua Hall. Joshua Hall. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. If I don't see you before the new year comes in, I hope you have a nice end of year. And I look forward to covering the Biden administration with you in the upcoming.
I will see you next year, Juliana. Have a good holidays.
Thanks. You too, Josh. Have a great one. I'm Juliana Forlano. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hey, what do you think about what we just discussed? Put in the comments. I'm finding that people are fearful of each other. And that's where we're at.